Dickens and childhood, with particular reference to Dickens's own childhood and the way that he uses childhood symbolically and narratively in his own writings. Of course, little Oliver Twist, the poor, abused, mistreated child in Dickens's first major novel, is perhaps the most famous example in English literature of a child suffering and being given callous treatment. And it's something not only to characterize 19th century literature, not only to characterize the novel, but as I say, perhaps through the whole of English literature, there isn't anything quite as sad as Poor Little Oliver Twist, or quite as well known, particularly here where he's portrayed asking for more. And it's just one example. We can find many others. Dickens's works are full of these hard-done-by little boys, particularly little boys, sometimes little girls, but particularly little boys. And so we can find plenty of examples through his writing. We've got David Copperfield, for example, the little boy suffering at the hands of his cruel stepfather and his stepfather's sister. Basically what's happened is that he's been left without a father. His father died just before he was born, and his mother has married this cruel, puritanical man, who later sends him off to school, where he is again beaten, mistreated, and the cruelty goes on. Not to the same extent, however, as it does in Nicholas Nickleby, where poor Smike is more or less in danger of dying, of being killed by his schoolmaster. Nicholas, the eponymous hero, actually escapes from the school. Nicholas is working there as a teacher. He leaves the school, taking Smike with him, just to get out and to get Smike out of that terrible situation. And we've got this kind of thing going on again and again in Dickens's novels. Children who are suffering at the hands of adults, and the adults are very often justifying what they do, saying, well, this is for the good of the child. They might have been taking it from the Bible, from the spare the rod and spoil the child passage in the Bible, which may be a misunderstanding of that particular passage, but that is how it was understood, that in order to make a child good, you had to punish that child physically. You had to chastise that child. We've got want and ignorance in Dickens's Christmas Carol. They are symbolic of childhood and of children. They are not real children in the sense that they're not real characters. They are simply representative of something. The message here is, if you treat your children in that way, if you leave them in want and you leave them in ignorance, then they're going to grow up and they are going to be members of your society. And what kind of members do you think they're going to be? So again, the message carries on in A Christmas Carol. And in Great Expectations, it's more of a psychological humiliation, where Miss Havisham, there she is, Miss Havisham, has taken under her wing a young girl. Here she is, the young girl. And her aim, Miss Havisham's aim, is to train the young girl, to bring the young girl up to psychologically humiliate men. And she's taken Pip, a young boy from the village, as a kind of training, as it were, for Estella, the girl that she's raising, the girl that she's adopted. And she takes pleasure in seeing Pip humiliated. Here, the humiliation is basically psychological. And again, in Dombey and Son, there's another poor, mistreated child. This time it's a little girl. As I say, usually it's a boy, but this time it's a little girl. And she is mistreated, again, largely psychologically, by her father, basically because her father wanted a boy. He didn't want a girl. And for the simple fact of having committed the mistake of being born the wrong sex, she's doomed to be looked down on and mistreated by her father. Now, Dickens is not really, not always at least, a negative writer. In fact, mostly not. So that Great Expectations with Pip, well, Pip is not a great success in life, and it's perhaps a sort of an exception in a way, because on the whole Dickens is a fairly positive, optimistic writer, and very often there's a happy ending to this. There's some sort of resolution where Florence in Dombey and Son will come to a reconciliation with her father. She'll come to have a more positive relationship with him. And Oliver Twist, of course, comes through in the end, in spite of his terribly difficult childhood. He's rescued at the end of the story, or he's rescued and his life is going to continue at the end of the story in a more positive way. So very often there's a sort of positive development. David Copperfield, of course, is relating something that is quite close to Dickens's own life. And that in itself was naturally something of a success story, since Dickens was one of the most successful writers of his period. So very often we're going to find that the abused child is not necessarily going to have a miserable life all the way through, but this picture of a child with an unhappy childhood is something that goes all through Dickens's writings. Okay, so let's take a look at the situation of children in the historical reality of Dickens's time. So that's the general picture. What about Dickens's childhood himself? What sort of life did he have? And it's very well noticed, often said, that the children in these novels, to some extent, reflect Dickens himself. That poor little boy, whoever it is, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, that poor little boy is Dickens to a certain extent. I mean, he fictionalizes, but he's kind of relating these things to his own life experience. So you really should take a look at John Forster, who was Dickens's friend and who wrote a biography of the author, and that looks into Dickens's childhood. It was something that he didn't really talk about very much to other people, so the fact that Forster was close to him, Forster was one of the few people that he confided in and told about his childhood. There was a lot of shame for Dickens connected in what had happened to him in his early childhood. The secret was that his father had got into debt. He owed money, and Dickens was taken out of school and sent to work in a factory. All right. It didn't go on for all that long. All right. It wasn't his whole childhood ruined. His father, managed to get out of prison and to improve the situation. He was sent to prison for debt, which is what happened in those days. He got out of prison. He sorted out his financial situation. Dickens went back to school. So he had to stick labels onto jars of boot polish. He was 12 years old, and that's what he had to do all day to try to help his family. And his father was sent to prison. It wasn't much money, it was only £40, but he hadn't paid it. And in those days, that's what they did. It was called the debtor's prison, and if you owed money, you could be put in prison until you paid it back, which was a rather stupid law, because while you're in prison, how are you supposed to get money? Okay, so in fact, I think in his case, it was his family, it was some sort of family money came in, and he was able to from other relatives, and he was able to get out of prison. But this is something that Dickens writes about in other works, the debtor's prison, people put into prison for owing money and how they get trapped into that situation. And about 4 months later, Dickens left the factory and he went back to school, but he never forgot the terrible experience. And so we get David Copperfield. David is sent off, not because his father is in debt. As we already noticed, Mr. Murdstone is simply nasty. And he sends the little boy, first of all, to school, and then after the mother dies, because the poor little boy's mother also dies, and then he can't even be bothered to send him to school anymore. He just sends him to work in a factory. All right? And there is poor little David, very, very much in the same position as Dickens himself when he was a little boy, working in a factory, doing very much the same kind of work. Here it's bottles, okay, but it's basically the same sort of thing. Sticking labels on bottles here. Washing bottles and sticking, basically washing, I think. Although in some movie versions they show him sticking labels in emulation of Dickens's actual experience. And then also in the same novel we get Mr. Micawber, who is a very likeable but eccentric man, and he's got no sense of money, and he's always getting his family into trouble. He has the similar sort of things happening to him as happened to Dickens's own father. But he's not the villain of the story. He's quite he's a very likable person, and he has a very good relationship with Charles. Charles has a reasonably good relationship in real life with his own father. In the novel, David has a very good relationship with Mr. Micawber, who is his landlord, so that David finds himself in London living in this man's family. And Mr. Micawber always treats him as a person, not as a child, but as an adult. He talks to David as if David was another adult. And David feels his identity. He feels, this man, I am a person to Mr. Micawber. And so Mr. Micawber plays a very positive part in terms of developing young David's identity. But he shares Dickens's real father's problem, which is he's not very good with money. Okay. And so, like Dickens's father, Mr. Micawber spends time in prison for debt. And in Little Dorrit too, the father of the family is sent to Marshalsea prison, the very same prison. He mentions the name of the prison where his own father was sent, and he is sent there for debt. So Dickens's childhood experiences are clearly reflected in his writing. So that much is obvious. We get something like this in David Copperfield. There he is washing those bottles, and no words can express the secret agony of my soul, the deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly without hope now, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was for my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learned and thought and delighted in, and raised my fancy and my emulation up by, would pass away from me, little by little, never to be brought back any more. It cannot be written. I mingled my tears with the water in which I was washing the bottles, and sobbed as if there were a flaw in my own breast, and it were in danger of bursting. Well, that's young David Copperfield talking in the novel David Copperfield, but it is also quite clearly Charles Dickens. All right, and to that extent, these suffering children are, in some way, Dickens himself. So, all right, what does that mean to us in terms of criticism of Dickens and how we might analyze him and write about him if we're going to write a paper about him, which you will be later on. So what would it mean in those terms? Well, just saying that a writer's work is based on his or her personal experience just really isn't a very interesting thing to do. And I would like you to go a little bit beyond that. It's something that students quite often do. I'm going to show that Dickens was influenced by his childhood. Well, yes, we know that. It's obvious. You can find that in Wikipedia. Okay, how would you kind of go a little bit beyond that? It's not only obvious that Dickens, bases his work on his experience, but that every writer does. What else can a writer do? A writer can't write about anything except a world that this world that we know about. Even if they create a fantasy world, it's still going to be connected in some way with reality, isn't it? I mean, look at Harry Potter, for example. It's a fantasy world, but the school that they go off to, Hogwarts, is just very much like an English public school. You know, the image of Eton or one of those elite schools, public school being an elite school in British English, not a Concordia school, but a private school. So that any writer of any kind is always drawing on their experience. So that doesn't really mean very much. But it can lead to some interesting questions, and that's what I'd like to look at. For example, what does it tell us about his psychology? Or what is the reason that after keeping that episode of his childhood secret for so many years, he suddenly chooses to tell Foster about it? And then he doesn't openly tell the world, but in a sense he publishes the message to the world because he fictionalizes it in David Copperfield. Why at that particular time, after keeping it secret for so many years? Was there a reason for that? Okay? There are research questions that we can pick out from the simple fact. But in your papers, I'd hope that you wouldn't just give me the simple facts of something like this, which, as I say, we can find in Wikipedia or something like that. I hope you would try to find a suitable research question that you could kind of really try to find the answer to some problem. There's a lot of debate about the role that Dickens's childhood played in his writing, and Edmund Wilson, one of the most famous critics of the last century, published Dickens' The Two Scrooges, and he puts forward the whole idea that the experience of his own father's imprisonment and that period in his life developed Dickens's identity into some special sort of attitude towards rebels against society, that whole alienation, that we are not necessarily friends of our society, that we are at war with our society, rebels against society, and the criminal mind. The relationship of the author to the criminal characters and to the law is very often critical of the law and shows us quite a lot of sympathy towards the criminals. And this is Dickens being commented on by Edmund Wilson in that essay, The Two Scrooges, which comes in a book called The Wound and the Bow. For the man of spirit whose childhood has been crushed by the cruelty of organized society, one of two attitudes is natural, that of the criminal or that of the rebel. Charles Dickens, in imagination, was to play the roles of both, and to continue up to his death to put into them all that was most passionate in his feeling. So here we've got a thesis which is saying, because of the relationship between his childhood and his writing, we find this particular sympathy for the outsider in society, for the criminal, the rebel. And that can be traced back to Dickens's childhood experiences. This has been challenged and disagreed with by some critics, and it's been added to by other critics. So we'll look at, for example, the fact that there are so many dysfunctional families, especially dysfunctional fathers. I mean, Mr. Micawber is just one example of a dysfunctional father. He's a nice guy, but he's a terrible, really, I mean, he's not a good father because he's not able to look after his family properly. And we get these dysfunctional families, and this is connected, this brings us back to this nature versus nurture debate that I've been talking about, whether our identity comes from our inner nature or from things that happen to us. And of course, in a certain way, Dickens is boasting about himself. He's saying, look at me, I had this horrible childhood, but I managed to succeed in spite of that. I didn't become a criminal. I could have become a criminal. I didn't become a terrorist rebel or something. I'm a good member of society, in spite of the terrible things that happened to me. Okay, so in some ways it's a sort of ego boost to him to show that he himself managed to get past those disadvantages of his childhood. Now there's a good review, Toru Sasaki, if you go to the print online, you can just click on that link, or you can search for it on Google, but I'll put that up on the website so you can find all these links. I'll put them up for you. And you can see how the various critics have taken different positions relating to showing how the childhood of Dickens actually influences or affects the way that he writes. So it's not just saying that Charles Dickens's childhood influenced his writing. We know that. But if you can tell us how, and if you can show your understanding of all these different critics who have different theories about how, well, then you're starting to do real academic writing. Okay? How is always a much better question, a much better thing to be showing than simply the fact that something is there. Okay. Now let's look at a kind of symbol of Dickens from his childhood. Gad's Hill. It looks pretty grand, or it looks like quite a nice house. I don't think it's as... I mean, there are much more grand and special houses in England, but for Dickens as a little boy, it was sort of a symbol of something. When he was a child, Dickens and his father used to go on long walks through the countryside, and they often went past this house, Gad's Hill, and his father would say to him, "My boy, if you work hard, if you really try in this life, you might live in that house, or you might live in a house like that one." And as a child, he often got that message that depending on how hard he worked and how hard he tried, he might be able to live in a house like that. Well, he became a successful writer, and he happened to notice that the house was up for sale, so he bought it. And his dream, the dream his father had told him when he was a little boy, came true. Another example of just how important his childhood was to him. Okay, he could have bought any house. He could have bought nicer houses even than this one. But he chose to buy that house and to stay there and live in it for the rest of his life. And it's a sort of symbol of the fulfillment of his childhood dream. The house is still there. It's recently been made into a Dickens museum, and it's a sort of symbol of the fulfillment of his dream. Okay?